what would be the result? For you, it would be disastrous. You would lose the ability to clean your blood, and unless you got a new liver, within a few days, you would die. But for me, it wouldn't make much difference. Your brain would work, Freudian slip. Your liver would work about as well in me as my old liver worked. Chances are I wouldn't notice anything very unusual. Now, liver transplants are not philosophically very exciting. But now suppose that your brain were transplanted into my head. I would certainly notice that. That would make a big difference. I would be able to speak perfect Spanish without ever having learned the language. I would know my way around Mexico without ever having lived there. I would suddenly acquire all sorts of new interests, new skills, new plans, and so on. At the same time, I would lose all my knowledge of philosophy. All the memories of my past would be gone. My childhood, my university studies, my last summer holiday would all be gone, as if it had never happened. Instead, I would have memories of your past, your childhood, your university studies, your summer holiday. My head would be filled with false beliefs. I would believe that I lived in your house, worked at your job, and was married to your spouse. I would be fully convinced that I was you. I would be systematically mistaken about who I am and how I fit into the world. What about you? Suppose the operation didn't kill you. Even so, you would lose, too far ahead. You would lose everything that matters. Consciousness, memories, knowledge, plans, abilities. You wouldn't even be able to feed yourself. You would be nothing but a vegetable. Unless, of course, you too got a new brain. If you got my brain, you would suddenly speak English like a native. You would be convinced that you lived in my house, worked at my job, and were married to my spouse. You would think you were a philosopher. I suppose you would be a philosopher. That might be some consolation for you. Now, you may be wondering at this point whether I've told this story in the right way. I said that if your brain were put into my head, I would get that organ and you would lose it, just as I would get an organ of yours in the liver transplant story. The only difference, I said, is that getting your brain would make me think like you, whereas getting your liver wouldn't make much difference. But perhaps what would really happen is not that I got a new brain, but that you got a new body. Maybe the one who woke up with your brain and my body would not be me, but you. Maybe transplanting your brain amounts to transplanting you. The brainless vegetable left behind when the surgeons remove your brain is not you, perhaps. Whoops, I'm sorry. Perhaps it's not you, but only your remains, the thing that used to be your body, something like that. Now, if this new way of telling the story is right, no one suddenly becomes able to speak Spanish without having learned it. No one has his true beliefs and memories replaced with false ones. No one is wrong about who he is. You simply find yourself with a new and unfamiliar face, arms, legs, and so on. Now, we can reinforce this view by adding a detail to the story. Suppose you had a terminal illness, a fatal illness, with only weeks to live, but your brain was still healthy. The surgeons offer to transplant your brain into my head. My own brain has been destroyed in an accident. Would you accept the offer? I bet you would. You would rather have your brain left intact in my head than have it die along with the rest of you. And I doubt whether you would think of this as an altruistic gesture for my benefit, kindly donating your splendid brain to a needy person before you die. You would see it as a way of surviving. You would see yourself taking over my body rather than giving me your brain. So maybe the brain transplant is not like the liver transplant. Maybe it's not really a brain transplant at all, but a body transplant. The surgeons don't transplant an organ from you to me. Rather, they transplant a body from me to you. Well, suppose this is right. You would go along with your transplanted brain. Now, this raises a serious question. No more fun and games now. Why would the one who got your brain be you and not me? You could donate your liver to me. Why not your brain? What makes the brain transplant so different from the liver transplant? And this is an instance of a more general question. What does it take for you to persist or survive from one time to another? What determines which past or future being is you? How does a being in the past or future have to relate to you in order for that being to be you? Now, if you really are the one who gets your transplanted brain, the reason seems to be that that person gets your psychology or your mind. He gets your memories, your knowledge, your beliefs, your plans, your personality, and all of that. There is psychological continuity between you and the one who gets your brain. There. That's what makes him you. He's not me because there's no psychological continuity between that one, between me and the one who gets your brain. Okay? He doesn't inherit any of my plans or memories or beliefs, but he gets yours instead. And likewise, your brainless body or brainless remains is not you because there's no psychological continuity there either. The general thinking here is that any past or future being is you just when he or she is psychologically continuous with you, just when that person gets your beliefs, memories, plans, and so on. So the person who was sitting in your chair 10 minutes ago was you and not someone else because you were psychologically continuous with that person. And philosophers call this the psychological continuity view. Can I make this work? Here we go. So what determines which past or future being is you? Psychological continuity. This seems to be the lesson of the brain transplant story. Okay. Now, if all this seems right to you, you're not alone. Most people, when they hear the brain transplant story, think you will be the one who gets your brain. And most professional philosophers think so too. The psychological continuity view is the conventional wisdom. In fact, it's been the conventional wisdom for hundreds of years. Now, I myself am not convinced. I think the philosophers have got it wrong in this case. They have forgotten a simple and elementary fact. We are animals, biological organisms. You and I differ in many ways from dogs, cats, snails, insects, and other animals, but we share with them the property of being a biological organism, an animal. And any philosophical theory about our nature needs to be compatible with this basic fact. Why do I say that we are animals? Well, think about it. There's a human animal sitting in your chair right now. That animal is conscious. It's thinking, it's listening to this talk. After all, it has your brain. Its brain is your brain. The animal is using its brain to think. Its thoughts are your thoughts. There aren't two thinking beings sitting there, listening to this talk. There aren't two beings sitting there wondering, what am I? There's only one being sitting there thinking. It is an animal. It's also a person. It is you. It seems pretty obvious that we're animals when you think about it. It would be very strange indeed if we were not animals. So, what have we learned so far? On the one hand, we're animals. On the other, it seems that we survive by virtue of psychological continuity. We would go along with our brains if they were transplanted. The trouble is, these two views are incompatible. They could not both be true. Here's why. Think about the brain transplant again. Never mind this time what happens to you. Think about what happens to the animals in the story. What happens to the animal when its brain gets transplanted? Well, the animal loses its brain and gets an empty head. Another animal acquires that organ. There are two organisms in the story, and the surgeons transplant an organ from one of them to the other, just as they do in the liver transplant. Okay? Now, what if you and I are animals? If you are an animal, you go where the animal goes. You go where the animal goes. You lose your brain. If I am an animal, I go where the other animal goes. I acquire your brain. Of course, getting your brain would make me think I was you. It would give me your memories and beliefs and plans and so on. But I would just be wrong about who I am. An animal does not go along with its transplanted brain. So if you are an animal, you don't go along with your transplanted brain either. Our survival does not consist in psychological continuity if we're animals. For the psychological continuity view to be true, we would have to be something other than animals. What would we be? Good question. So, as I see it, the psychological continuity view is wrong because it's incompatible with our basic nature, with the fact that we are animals. That is the danger of basing your thinking on science fiction stories and neglecting basic, simple, unsexy facts. Now, you may wonder whether any of this matters much. You're never going to have a brain transplant. For now, anyway, the whole story is science fiction. So why worry about it? Well, the question is not purely academic. There are real cases where it makes a difference. Now, here's a true story. Terri Schiavo was a woman living in the American state of Florida. In 1990, at the age of 26, she had a heart attack. She survived, but with severe brain damage, and she never regained consciousness. A year later, she was diagnosed as being in what the medics call a persistent vegetative state. She was biologically alive. She needed no life support mechanism, only a feeding tube. But she was completely incapable of any thought or consciousness. A very sad story. She remained in this state for 15 years. In 1998, 8 years later, her husband asked for her to be allowed to die, and there was a lengthy court battle. In 2005, the feeding tube was finally removed, and Terri Schiavo died soon afterwards from dehydration. That is how the story was told in the media and in the courts. Terri Schiavo lay unconscious for 15 years. But according to the psychological continuity view, this description is wrong, completely mistaken. The unconscious being was not Terri Schiavo at all. That's because there was no psychological continuity between the healthy woman and the unconscious being in the hospital. On the psychological continuity view, Terri Schiavo left the scene in 1990. When the heart attack destroyed her mind, she ceased to exist. Or maybe she passed on to the next world. I'm not going to talk about the afterlife today. That's a more advanced topic. Some other time. Something else on this view, not Schiavo, lay unconscious for 15 years. So when the doctors finally stopped the feeding, they did not cause anyone to die. And indeed, no one died then. Something died then, but it wasn't Terri Schiavo. It had never been married to Schiavo's husband. His desire that his wife be allowed to die was based on the false belief that the unconscious being was his wife. The case continues to be systematically misdescribed. Now, that's what follows from the conventional wisdom, the psychological continuity view. You can see why. Terri Schiavo relates to the unconscious vegetable in just the way that you relate to the empty-headed vegetable in the brain transplant story. If Terri Schiavo could survive without any psychological capacities with a badly damaged brain, then you would be able to survive without any psychological capacities with no brain at all. So the psychological continuity view implies that Terri Schiavo was never in a vegetative state. But if I'm right to say that you and I are animals, the ordinary description of the case is correct. It is perfectly possible for a human organism to survive in a vegetative state. It really was Terri Schiavo who lay unconscious for 15 years. Here's one more case where it makes a difference. Think of an unborn fetus that doesn't yet have any psychology. Think, if you like, of the fetus that gave rise to you. Oop, all right. Another scientific illustration here. Now, the psychological continuity view implies that that fetus was not you. You were never an unthinking fetus. No such fetus can ever come to be one of us. Why? Because there's no psychological continuity here. You did not inherit your memories, beliefs, plans, and so on from an unthinking fetus. So you can no more have been a fetus than you could come to be an empty-headed vegetable. You could not have come into being before the fetus became conscious and acquired psychological properties. When is this? Well, the physiologists say it takes place at mid-gestation at the very earliest, and probably later than that. This would be important news for debates about the moral status of the unborn, which I'm not going to go into. Now, my own view implies that you were once a fetus because each human organism starts out as an unthinking fetus. That surely is the sensible view. I haven't proved beyond doubt that we are animals and that the psychological continuity view is false. I've only given certain arguments, and many people reject my arguments. But those who accept the conventional wisdom, the psychological continuity view, have to answer two hard questions. First, if we are not animals, what are we? And how can I know that I am not the animal thinking my thoughts? These are questions I'm glad I don't have to answer. Thank you.